Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all living nature of which we are a part as nature's children, with deep gratitude to all the generations before us who have brought us to the present moment in the human journey, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. One of the things that we try to do on Humanity Rising is take the full spectrum of the human endeavor. So we keep up with current events, we keep up with science, economics, politics, culture, art, spirituality. And today we want to delve into an existential challenge that every human being since the dawn of time has grappled with, either consciously or unconsciously, and that is the question of free will. Do we, as individuals, do we as a collective, do we exercise free will at all? And if so, how? If we're in a unitary cosmos where everything is interconnected with everything else, and as Plotinus said 2,000 years ago, the entire universe breathes as one, what's the relationship between the one and the many? The ancient Greek philosopher Parmenides in the 6th century BC, who was really the first Greek philosopher of note, his answer was that there was no free will, that the universe as a single solitary integrated whole moved at its own will, and that we were small, infinitesimally minute little specks in the totality. Just imagine an atom in one of the cells of your body. Does that atom have free will? Do the cells in your body have free will? Do your organs, your heart, does that have free will? So this issue is not so easy. We like to think we have it. I certainly have endeavored to exercise free will. We think we have choices. But the magnitude is something that's quite mysterious and elusive. So today we have two philosophers, two deeply concerned psychologists who've been contemplating these matters and have found the physics of David Bohm, who we've talked about numerous times on Humanity Rising, the great physicist of the last century, a colleague of Albert Einstein's and others, who developed the whole notion of cosmic wholeness and what he called the implicate order, the interconnectedness of all being. And within that context, David Bohm wrestled with this issue of free will. So that's our subject today, everyone, and it's something that we will ponder deeply in subsequent programs, I'm sure, because this is not an issue that is ever satisfied or solved once and for all by anyone. So we always approach these matters in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. Before we dive into this program, let us just take a pause, as we always do as we commence our Humanity Rising sessions. Let it just center ourselves in our bodies. We are Earth. We are nature. We are the trees. And as we center ourselves in our bodies, close your eyes if you can. And center yourself on your heart just for the next minute. Feel your heartbeat. And through the mysteries of the heart, feel each other. Feel the cosmos. feel the totality if you can. And ask yourself, where is my will? Thank you, everyone. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mark Harrison, who was on Humanity Rising some months ago and made some comments about free will that I found so intriguing that we engaged in a conversation and we invited Mark to come back to dedicate a whole program on this issue within the framework of David Bohm's physics and notion of the implicate order. Mark started his career as a scientist in computation, working in big aerospace and power generation companies and endeavors. And then in 2005, he took a certificate in psychology and counseling, worked for many years in hospice, and developed a whole new career in the humanistic domain of healing and insight and therapy, empowering himself and his patients to delve deeply into who they are and thereby create a path of wholeness and healing. He's contemplated very deeply the matters of the human spirit. So Mark, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. I want to thank you for joining us today. And Mark and a colleague, Steve Cox, who Mark will introduce in a moment, will guide us in an exploration of this very deep issue of free will and an exploration of related matters. And then I'll circle back and we'll have a dialogue for the balance of the time. So thank you, Mark. Welcome to Humanity Rising.
Thank you again, Jim. It's good to see you again. And thank you for inviting me on and offering this space for a bit of dialogue. I'm just hoping I can live up to your introduction. Before you pull
that I have no doubt.
Hello, everybody. So yeah, what I want to do here is basically explore my belief in a randomly determined free will with a creative ethos, as the title puts it. Hopefully I can access the chat, which is here before me now. I'm going to put my email in there. And if I don't manage to pick up on anything before during the session, then maybe we can pick it up later, or if anyone wants to further connect, by all means, email. What I'm looking at, as Jim has maybe already shown, is quite wide in scope. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just initially introducing it. And my apologies for reading somewhat to make sure it does stay short. and then I'll bring in Steve Cox to help me build the discussion. Steve's kindly agreed to be with me here, and I welcome wherever it may go, drawing in anything from the chat if we can. Before launching in, I think it's worth me pointing out that I'm quite happy with the idea of free will, meaning I have choice, real choice, and that it's my internal values and randomness that will determine my choice, determine what I do. The paradox of free will, as Jim's indicated, paradox of free will and determinism, has been a philosophical discussion for many centuries. And faced with that paradox, I've finally come to believe in a randomly determined free will. My thinking is, roughly, if there is nothing to determine our decisions, if we are entirely free, then the decision could not be made. There's nothing to determine it. The only form of complete freedom seems to me to be randomness. So when we're faced with nothing rational or logical or mathematical, nothing scientific, nothing that's been indoctrinated in us, values gained through socialization, culturalization, and our nurture, and if we have no genetic personal preferences to determine our decisions, then it seems we can still somehow resort to tossing a coin. And Steve in the chat may well pick up and expand on this later. My perspective was reinforced by my time in the world of computing. Although it was not specifically my field, I had some interest in AI, artificial intelligence, and learning machines. I pondered at length how to program or to build a free will. What I realized was the simple fact that we cannot program a computer to generate true randomness, to have what I'm now thinking is free will. In order to act randomly, computers generally refer to the external environment. They check the outdoor temperature, use that as a basis to create random numbers. Maybe the reality is we just do the same, but I'm not sure we do. I think it's more along the lines as Jim has already sort of touched on. So back in computing, when I was reading authors like Douglas Hofstadter on AI, I met the problems of infinite regression, strange loops, that sort of idea, both computationally and even mathematically. We get stuck at a sort of self-referential paradox. And a long-term example of that has been the sentence, "This sentence is false." This form of self-referential paradox, not just in language, but in maths and everything else, echoes throughout everything. In maths, it comes out as Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theory. And then in quantum physics, we have things like relativity and entanglement, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And once again, all these different themes may be picked up on in the ongoing discussion. Where computers fail, it seems humans have some sort of mystical internal ability to always make a decision, to close the decision. And if necessary, randomly determine what's going to happen next. And I believe it goes beyond simply sampling the outdoor temperature. And that brings me to the aspect of a creative ethos. This comes from being faced with my own existence, rather than the far simpler situation of absolutely nothing existing. I first met René Descartes' line, "I think, therefore I am," or "I doubt," in my teenage years. I still believe it offers the fact that at least I, as a doubting entity, exist. From then, I have steadily believed that something exists, and therefore something always exists. There isn't absolutely nothing, and paradoxically never can be. There is always potentially something. I think of it as being like the initial conditions of existence, just like the initial conditions of the universe when thinking about the Big Bang, or as the timeless and eternal conditions of existence. This sits well with my understanding of quantum physicist David Bohm's concept of an implicate order, as Jim mentioned. What he saw was a sort of non-dualistic, timeless and eternal, dimensionless and infinite realm of random chaos, just random happening, the minimum that could possibly exist, the closest we can get to absolutely nothing. And that random happening is a tendency to become explicit, to unfold from the implicate order into explicit existence, or the explicate order, as David Bohm called it. So that's where the idea of a creative ethos comes from, in terms of an underlying ether, a whole bed, an infinite bed of randomness, with a tendency to unfold, emerge or evolve into something explicit, to be creative. Bohm considered that at the implicate level, there is nothing definable or knowable. The idea of concepts like time or space, as well as the reality of time or space, these thoughts are something that have unfolded from it and are enfolded within it. There is not even a sense of separateness in the infinite order. This addresses that self-referential paradox of this sentence is false, the Gödel's mathematics and such like, through recognizing the wholeness or oneness of the entirety of existence, again, as Jim's already mentioned. There is no external, so there's no external temperature to refer to. Through wholeness, we close the self-referential paradox. That's the way I see it. Bohm used the analogy of a hologram to describe how he considered each of us being enfolded throughout the implicate order, as one, throughout the entirety of existence, not just the entirety of the universe, but across any other universes, the entire realm of existence. At the same time, the entirety of existence is enfolded within each of us and available as a referent. Just as in a holographic image, every fragment of that image contains a whole image. So, all that gives me the perspective that our free will is randomly determined through our interconnection or interpenetration, our enfoldment with that implicate order. With that is a creative ethos, providing a basis from which all our values could emerge, a sort of bias at the level of initial conditions. And that enables an alignment or misalignment, a congruence or an incongruence with the creative flow between implicate and explicate. I see it as a basis for experiencing our holding of our values and then of our feelings and emotions. I am considering our unfoldment as being a sort of sixth sense, maybe equating it with psychologist Carl Rogers' concept of an internal locus of evaluation. So, I've tried to give a little bit more detail as to the perspective I'm offering for discussion. I now want to welcome Steve Cox, who's been a colleague in the world of psychological counselling for many years, to further explore this here and now for the next hour or so, however he may feel fit. I'm just simply going to pass over to you, Steve. Take it away.
Okay, well, I hope you all understood that, because I'm going to test you now. No, I'm really not, because I don't think the subject's so vast that I need to bring in some other elements really to unpack this. And what struck me in the first place was there is a kind of paradox, as certainly on on some kind of level between randomness and order. And two kind of things popped into my head. One was something I got from, I think it was feminist psychotherapy. And that was the idea of a simple model of life. And on one side, you have chaos, and obviously kind of randomness kind of came to mind when, so this is why I'm using this model. So on one side, you have got chaos. On the other side of the pole, you've got control. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we live in either realm. We get stuck, really. Either we get overwhelmed by the chaos, or we kind of get so rigid in the control. Mm. But life really is a weave between those two. We need to control the chaos. So the creativity, as you introduced, for me comes in the form of this weave between chaos and control. And that's life, that's living. Somehow between these two kind of quite set poles, one chaos, one control, we can move between the two, and from control we can bring some, we need both. We need to control the chaos, but we need chaos in the first place to generate something.
So just let me grab that there, Steve. So yeah, entirely chaotic to begin with a slight tendency towards creativity. But if we're not careful, the creativity can become too much control and become rigid. Almost like we talk sometimes, another of Carl Rogers' terms is fixity and fluidity. Mm-hmm. It can become over-fixed. Even our universe may be a fixed way of being that may eventually prove untenable and collapse. But there's got to be that way of trying to work with the chaos to stay flexible at all levels. Is that fair?
Yeah, you've just reminded me of something that Eckhart Tolle kind of refers to in terms of time. The only time really is now. Mm-hmm. But what he refers to sometimes is clock time. Clock time is where our heads are for a lot of the time, because we're planning something. We've got a meeting to go to. So we're always kind of thinking perhaps outside of now. But as long as we touch now, as long as we come back to it, we've got our feet on the ground. We're in touch with our bodies again. We're kind of, we're present, even though so much of our time is kind of in clock time. So the two things kind of coexist, even if one is more of an illusionary nature, which is the clock time.
So that would pick up, I think I said in the intro, about the idea of separation. Mm-hmm. When we're looking at the implicate order, there is no separation of now and past and future. There is only now. Mm-hmm. And that all past and all future is wrapped into the now. That sort of idea as part of the implicate order. Yeah, but it's for whatever reason, we find it useful to invent the concept of clock time and allow our minds to run with that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, indeed. The other person that sprang to mind was Andreas Agnel, who was a psychologist in the 40s and 50s, well, 40s, I think, mostly, but wrote, he was the person that came up with the idea of the biosphere. And one of the things he talked about human beings being both autonomous and homonymous. So the homonymy was the idea that we needed to live as a collective. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, because we experience the world through our individuality, mm-hmm. There was an autonomous nature as well. But these two things were simultaneous. And yet, so again, there was explained the individual organism as well as a collective organism, something that works together. And he was challenged on this and said, well, look, if this is so, then how do you explain antisocial behavior where people are not very homonymous there, are they? They're not actually working as a collective there.
Mm-hmm.
And Aniel was quite clear. He said, well, there's still sociability in that. There's honor amongst thieves. They still have a code of practice which brings people together. So I think, again, it explains something of the paradox that's been alluded to.
I guess that strikes a couple of thoughts for me. One is the sort of Darwinistic line of survival of the fittest, which I've always understood to actually be more effectively said as survival of the best fit, the most harmonious, I feel. And so that's one thing there. And then that sense for me of antisocial behavior, etc., is maybe in part, I'm not saying this is entirely it, but maybe that's a part of a descent. So when you initially talked about control becoming too rigid, but for someone who the society is too rigid, where they feel I can't be myself, then they rebel. They're dissentful against the society. They might just be entirely selfish and not worried about others and their own victims, but maybe it's a part of rebellion. So their dissenting or rebellion, for me, is something about questioning the system, that level of dissent, as if like dissent in an organization at any level. Yeah, I don't know if that fits reasonably.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, absolutely. And what it stimulated for me was how randomness and order coexist.
Mm-hmm.
And where you have groups of people forming that perhaps are against or seemingly against other groups of people, or even people against the planet, for example, then you have this struggle of, I think, of randomness and order. That order is always trying to form, but it doesn't necessarily kind of involve everybody. So it's quite a kind of jumbled, perhaps, collection really of things trying to reach a potential, and yet it sometimes it acts against, it jars.
That takes me back into computers. That idea of there's a desire for things to move together for a harmonious movement, and yet something can just jar that. Something can act against it for whatever reason.
A glitch.
And I'm thinking of, I don't know if anyone's ever seen these, but John Conway wrote a computer program called Life. And it was nothing more than about 5 or 6 basic rules, but it would result in patterns on the screen that seemed to just crawl lifelike across the screen. But if they collided with something, they would just dissipate, things like that. And further to that, people wrote a program. There was a program called Birds, but it's spelt funny, but it mimics the murmuring of a mass of birds. So on the screen, it looks very much like a rolling flock of starlings, that sort of thing, as they roll across the sky. And that same thing, there's this huge apparent shape rolling across the sky harmoniously. And yet every now and again, you'll get the predator bird or whatever, a tree getting in the way. And the whole shape flows differently, changes differently, sometimes just fractures altogether. So for me, that idea of the randomness with very, very simple initial conditions, initial rules, soon creates quite complicated order, but that order is tenuous or vulnerable to dissent. If I can put it that way.
There's a fragility about it.
Yeah.
And yet there's a robustness.
Yeah. Yeah, when that sort of flock of birds allows for the predator, or effectively survives the predator and finds new shape and rolls on in new form.
One of the things that comes up for me in this discussion is when you talk about things perhaps getting in the way, a predator or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this can happen in early life with people, and it keeps people like me and you employed to some extent. People go through. I've gone through, and no doubt you've gone through kind of many kind of traumatic things in life, which tend to perhaps disrupt the kind of natural order are kind of working towards. And yet from those places, some kind of new order emerges, perhaps, which brings people, or can bring people, into a kind of almost more growthful state.
Mm-hmm.
And so whilst things can be disrupted, they can also find kind of new ways forward. People can.
You take me back 30 years there. And I know I've had this sort of a discussion with several people over the last few weeks, and it always goes somewhere different. Even as you and I talked about the idea of being here together, it's always been different when we talk.
Yeah.
And what you take me back to is a book called The Age of Unreason by Charles Handy, which was a management guru of old, who was a management guru of old. And he talked about discontinuous change and S-curves. This was the point where I realized I was never going to make it into management circles because I was too much of a dissenter. But there is there's generally this S-curve shape of growth that order builds, and then it reaches its maximum and it sort of tails off. So it might just get a bit better, but largely it's an S-shaped curve. And in order to then grow more, having plateaued, one has to do a discontinuous leap. One has to change radically the paradigm you're operating in or whatever, and actually start a new curve and find a new way of growing. So that just hit me there with what you were saying, just hit me as that sort of something forces a discontinuous change. And instead of just trying to continue with the same order, but making it better, we jump to a new order, a different way of looking at things.
I guess when some kind of fragmentation seems to take place, it can feel as though we're perhaps leaping onto a new order or trying to find some different way. But I can't help feeling in essence it must be of the same, it's the same order as you've explained, I think. So
same overall order covering both S-curves. Is that?
No, I'm almost thinking here myself that maybe something appears to be broken, but in traveling to get to the next S-curve, I tell you where I'm at with this one. I see things. The model that works for me is more circular. So we might kind of start with the story. We might find that we start going downhill, we might find ourselves at the bottom, and then we might find ourselves kind of having to crawl up this kind of circular. Depending on how we treat ourselves or what narrative we use, it can seem like we're slipping down. It can seem like we're going backwards. It can seem like we're going upwards and kind of conquering something. But in essence, we just keep on going round, except that rather than be going round and round, every time we learn something, we move slightly. So it's more like a slinky unfolding. And that way we can continue in this continuous kind of movement, this fluidity, if you like, but perhaps not at the same pace. The slinky the circles can get bigger or smaller. They can kind of tumble in a different way. But so it's more like a kind of an extended spring rather than, so there's movement, but there's also circular movement continually.
So the image I get there is of myself or any person as that murmuring flock of birds, that we are a whole and yet we're also sub-wholes within that. But that the holonic theory, sort of, is it Kostler, and that holonic theory, and that sense of we are a whole and we continue to exist as a whole, even though we might have broken apart and reformed in quite a different shape. And you're seeing that as a continuous cycling of, here I am learning and evolving and continuing through life, sort of thing.
Yeah, very much. And of course, it's always problematic, I think, talking about humanity within a bigger environment. We're talking about an environment that, it encompasses the whole universe. And I think this is another thing that I think, which I can look to Aniel for, is the idea that although we're of the universe, we cannot be extracted from it. At the same time, our environments always determine I guess you could say, the limitations of our movement within. Within that, of course, we have choices to make about how we do things. And when I started to think initially, really, about when we were asked to just focus on at the very beginning, before you and I spoke a word, about kind of just focus on what it means, our own individual will. I went kind of internally, and I found that actually the order of my cells were pretty kind of fixed and regular in a sense. They had a job to do, and but they still would respond to stimulus. And there's something about my actions also that has choice in terms of how I do something. It's affected by the environment that I'm in. But there's something about how I do something.
So I guess what I'm getting there is, again, I'm with holonic theory, Kostler. Yeah, it is Kostler. And the idea that my physical body is a bunch of organs working together. And each organ by itself has its own limits of operation. It responds to the environment of the rest of the body, and it provides accordingly, according to how it seems to be called. And so I'm sort of seeing that same sort of idea. There's that constant relationality, what was the word you used? The harmoniosity, was it? The word. you know,
Yeah.
that it is finding harmony in order to work together to keep this body going, this set of order alive.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I could think that maybe our thoughts are nothing more than the feelings of all our organs going, you need a drink now, you need to eat now, yeah, whatever. That emerges out of this conglomeration of subholes that I am. Am I catching you here, or am I just going off?
Well, I hope you're going off to some extent, because I wouldn't want us to go round in an absolute circle. I'd hope we move somewhere. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's very relevant. Indeed, you know, the thing that struck me, one word that links so much of this together, that makes more sense perhaps than many, is the idea of relationship. That, you know, we have a relationship with everything. We have an internal relationship. Each cell communicates with its adjacent cell, and therefore, you know, a conversation kind of happens both internally, externally, both together, collectively. You know, and what's key, I think, and in this whole endeavor, I think, of these kinds of talks, is to find a way forward that makes more and more kind of sense, brings more and more kind of perhaps order and some kind of harmonious interaction.
So for me, this for me now is a thread going back to the idea of initial conditions. So I'm offering Bohm's Implicate Order as like an initial conditions of existence. And it consists of two things. One is a whole infinite realm of randomness, just pure random on-off happenings, if I can put it that way, quantum shifts, something like that. And with that is a tendency for that to happen, the movement from nothingness to somethingness and back, you know, as a constant flow. And one of the things that hits me there, and this goes back many years for me, is, as you said about relationship. Now I was, until about age 6, I was brought up in a gentle Christian belief. And within that is the idea of the Trinity, the you, I, and relationship between us. And I'm wondering about that as a sort of standard pattern, a sort of triunic pattern. And some of the neuroscientists talk about a triunic brain. And I wonder of the idea of separation being one of the most primary emergencies or emergent things. So from the implicate order, firstly, comes, the idea of an explicate order. But you then got explicate and implicate and the relationship, the flow between them. So it's almost like the most primary of patterns that I think then echoes right through, that a good relationship means we can be more creative, be it in internal relationships or be it relationships between each other.
When you have a me and a you, we can also arrive at a we. And through that process, we can arrive at a completely different place. If you're offering something of you and I'm offering something of me, and we're offering that openly, and we're actually listening at the same time, we can arrive at a place which is brand new. But we can only do that if we're kind of honest and open with each other, and I guess that endeavor as well. We can close it down, we can get in the way of that, I think, natural place. But I think it allows for something. It allows for a new destination, a new arrival. And for me, there's a you and a me, and there's something bigger as well. There's all of us, or everything. So there's it's more of a square.
So for me, what you're talking there is what both of us do in terms of therapy, in the idea of meeting a client who we work with, and through a joint open venture into our vulnerabilities, we allow something, we try and get past a rigidity, a fixity in the client. We try to find a new way of operating that is more adaptable to their environment. Not to make conformance, but to allow optimization, if I can put it that way. And for me, that was taken from therapy into interpersonal relationships by Carl Rogers himself, and through into encounter group and group work, which Peter Smith picked up on a lot more about encounter and divineness, etc. And it was by chance when I first came to David Bohm, which was through a meeting with Jill Wyatt years ago. That through there came his work on dialogue and his idea of meeting and talking together without having any intent, just simply being willing to listen, hear different perspectives, and be open and vulnerable to different perspectives. I think there's a lot of healing, I think will be the word, healing as in making whole. But by being as flexible as we can be, as open and vulnerable as we can be to each other, then we become more connected with the greater whole, if I put it that way.
Yeah. And again, you remind me of Roger's notion of the actualizing tendency, and a little later, the formative tendency, where again, that he articulates really that the whole purpose of any organism is to maximize, is to enhance itself and to maximize its potential. And he saw that basic trend. It was a universal one. So that the universe itself becomes more ordered, more sophisticated, more creative.
That's the thing. So we're talking here about, particularly, I'll just offer the book reference, which is Carl Rogers' A Way of Being, and his chapter in there on the formative tendency. And I can't remember what the chapter's called. And that's where he talks about his influences like Aniel, that you already mentioned, and the physicists even leading into David Bohm. Yeah. And that sort of sense of connecting with a wider organizing tendency as that formative tendency. Yeah, because that's where the effect of that, a lot of the beliefs that I'm trying to explain now sort of became far more solid in looking at that idea of a formative tendency throughout the universe and throughout existence.
And yet often the mechanism to arrive at something which is more homonymous was a group of people meeting in a very random way. There were no kind of set agendas. There were no set rules. There were just the requirement, if you like, was for people to turn up and try and get somewhere. Well, that's what happened, I think. A lot of things, maybe that language isn't so sympathetic to the endeavor, but
I think there's something there where, and I think you and I have both got experience of meetings in the past where it feels like somebody in the meeting is out to make trouble. So back to the dissenting idea.
Sometimes it was me.
I've done my own bits, I suppose. There's something there for me of that idea of we have an intention of trying to find that flow and go with a creative flow. And yet for some people, it can be felt like you're trying to impose something on me here. There's some unspoken rules and nobody's telling me what they are. When there aren't any rules, it's just everybody expressing their preferences. And that sort of idea.
Yes and no, I think, would be my answer to that. Because again, I think that if by nature our organisms are trying to enhance and maximize ourselves, there is some kind, whether you call it a rule or a tendency or something. For me, this goes back to the maybe best explained the Taoist principle, but again, being with Tao, being in flow with the rhythm of life, if you like. That somehow we can tune in, and equally we can tune out. I think a lot of my living time is kind of disconnected. You know, I'm not connected. My mind and body aren't kind of in any great connection. But when that happens, when they come together, then there's something very special that happens. I'm all of a sudden I'm present. I'm in the here and now. I'm kind of, that has to be for me. It's not, because I know that my mind and body cannot be separated, but at the same time, I can almost forget that my body exists. I cannot give it attention. And I think so we can be disconnected at the same time as being, it's impossible not to be connected.
I think that's an interesting point for me. It's how if we believe in as I'm putting it, a creative ethos, and Carl Rogers came through maybe with the idea of, he believed that people are basically good rather than evil. And his discussions with Rollo May around good or evil, I think are always worth a visit. But it's that question of, well, where does evil come from? And for me, that then leads into that idea of who's going to stand against that creativity? Who's going to try and derail this meeting of people? That sort of thing. Who's going to try and throw a spanner in the works, and why? And for me, that's something about their own fixity, their own sense of, this is who I am, and this is who I identify as, and I am too challenged, and I'm going to defend myself by attacking this environment, something like that. And for me, this is a bit like the birds murmuring. A lot of random events that either add up to just creative, you know, like so many rolls of the dice. Is it just going to add up to 4 or more, or is it just going to add up to 3 or less, depending on this infinite number of rolls of the dice? And I sometimes think that the randomness means that now and again, people get stuck with it. They get sidelined into their own fixity of who they are, their own rigidity, and then get defensive about it. And so they're not willing to be open and transparent, as we were saying earlier, in relationship. There's not necessarily a deliberate deceit, but there's a lack of willingness to really be there and to openly be there and to truly hear what others are offering.
the word that screams loudly at me is fear. When fear kind of raises its head, and attitude is the other thing, because if I can embrace those times when I'm fearful,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately ask of fear, what does it hold for me? What's my kind of learning lesson or whatever? What has it got for me?
Mm-hmm.
Then, even though it can be uncomfortable, then I can somehow make friends with it. I can sometimes somehow see it as something which is potentially useful. But if I turn around and say something along the lines of, I shouldn't be fearful,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm really stuffed, because I am. I am fearful, and I'm telling myself I shouldn't be. So there's a huge dissonance there. There's a disconnect.
That reminds me, there's that Carl Rogers quote, isn't there, where he says something along the lines of, the more I can accept myself as I am, the more I am able to change.
Yeah, which again sounds very paradoxical, but that has in practice has a simplicity, a beauty to it.
And that for me comes back to that sense of free will, that if I have the self-awareness that I'm feeling fear, then I can maybe take that into account and work with it.
I can let it in
harmoniously.
Mm-hmm.
But if I do not recognize my own fear, then I can maybe act, my choices are influenced unduly by that, for want of a better word, unconscious fear.
I think for me, there's a separation here, because in something, when you talked about good and evil, which are always kind of, in some ways, dubious things, but I suppose what I'm mindful of is that creativity isn't always good. I can, there's a lot of creativity in, a war, for example. You can, you can do a lot of damage creatively. So I think, again, choice is somehow it comes, free will is might be in there. And that's why something is either good or evil, because it's for people. It actually represents something which is selfless in lots of ways, or it's and that's a strange term, because I always think if it's for other people, it has to be for me. I can't leave myself out of that. So, or it can be destructive. It can somehow feed into fear and other things. The randomness of life can create some pretty kind of ugly things, I think.
Which is, and these are difficult structures to talk about, but that idea of conforming to my society, supporting my government in choices about international foreign policy, that sort of thing, and maybe not being actually active in that, maybe not sort of particularly paying attention to that, maybe being very simply, I'm going to vote Conservative or Labour, Republican or Democrat, and I don't, that's what I vote because I've always voted that way. And there's no real thought of, well, what are the policies going on here? What's happening in the international field to make this country richer, possibly at another country's expense? Things like that. And that sense of how we can maybe come on board with a group, an organization, group dynamics can take hold, and we're wrapped into identifying with that group, finding our value within that group, and then threatened by the thought of possibly dissenting from that group or going against that group. I think a classic is going on right here and now here in the UK, and I'm wondering if a lot of people are actually in the US, but we have a prime minister that effectively has broken the law and has lied to the rest of Parliament, and yet the party around him, the Conservative Party, effectively are still struggling with, do we or don't we support this guy? And I wonder what that's all about. And that sort of emergence of these sorts of dynamics where it's something like, we can't just, we need to maybe stop that support of where something is very definitely wrong. And that's maybe my politics coming out as well there.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I'm kind of mindful of the time, as I always am on about the hour, because it's work, and I'm wondering where we go. I just want to check in with you, really, whether.
Yeah, I'm aware of running that we've now. If Jim was going to come back in, and he might want to appear at any time, it may be. Well, he's going to appear now. Here he is.
We've summoned Jim.
And I don't know what there is to pick up from in the chat or anywhere, or if there's any questions or anything that to feed into what we've covered. I don't know if we've done any effective coverage of anything at all, which is fine by me.
Well, you've circled around the great mystery. And that is all we humans ever can do, I'm afraid. But you've done it in a very thoughtful way. So I want to thank you, Steve, for being such a skillful interlocutor with Mark, because this is a dialogue. And that was, I think, what I wanted to say first is that, you know, the humblest way to approach the abyss of mystery is dialogically, in shared pursuit of the truth, rather than any of us thinking that we can sit like the Pope ex cathedra on the throne of St. Peter and declare the infallible doctrine of such and such and so and so. So I, as someone who's deeply immersed in the Platonic tradition, Ubiquity University traces its lineage through Chartres, the Chartrean masters of about 1,000 years ago, back to Plato's Academy and his great notion inherited by Socrates that ultimately the pursuit of truth is a dialogue between seekers. And it's the dialogue itself that is the container. And the truth emerges through the depth of the questions that we can ask of one another as we traverse the road of life. So you've embodied that today. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that and note that with appreciation for what you've been discoursing about. And I've been following the chat, and I have a couple of questions that I'd like both of you to comment on as we proceed, just to further illumine. I was very interested, Mark, in your initial identification of free will as occurring as that which is implicate becomes that which is explicate. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think that's a very interesting place to think about where free will takes place, that it's not kind of a generic phenomenon that exists everywhere about everything, but it's a very specific phenomenon that takes place when the implicit order is moving into the explicit. So, and Steve, you may have some comments too, but would love to just deepen the dialogue around that nexus point.
I think for me, that bounces me straight from what you already said to a section right at the back of Roger Penrose's book, The Emperor's New Mind. And he's talking about Platonic forms and how through dialogue, a very complex idea, mathematical idea in explaining quantum physics, for example, being a tutor, trying to help a student to take on that idea, to form their own understanding, their own meaning of a mathematical concept that's very difficult to grasp. And that happens within that mix of dialogue, that if the two of them can be quite open to each other, then they can tap into that greater bed of implicate order to allow the formation or allow the emergence within the second person, the student, of that meaning, of something that is almost like a Platonic form, a very basic rule of the universe, if I put it that way. I don't know if that adds to that idea. So by being open, then the implicate order is more able to come through and to resonate, I suppose, with what already exists in the student and maybe in the tutor as well, in order to create new meaning. And that new meaning is an explicate meaning. Does that catch you?
Yeah. Steve, do you have any comment?
Well, I'd like to approach it perhaps from a different angle. And I was thinking of mother and baby, where there is no language. There is nothing from baby's point of view has been learnt yet. So baby is just in its perfection. It doesn't, in some ways, it doesn't need any learning, but what it needs is communication. So it sends out all of these random kind of noises, seems to me, quite. And mother has to learn that from baby. So there's a communication which happens again. There's some tapping into it. You have to suspend what you think you know to get back, or to maybe get back is not quite the right terminology, but just to envelop what is known and trust that a dialogue can exist with some really kind of quite, well, very basic form of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's the same story, just from a different perspective.
I think that's a really good point there. In terms of the word communication, for me, has become too much of I will communicate to you and you can communicate to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's lost the sense of making communicating, making a common ground where we can both exist.
Yeah, beautiful point. Beautiful point. Communication is how two intelligences or more commune together. And that's the essence of real dialogue, is not the differences, although those arise because the perspectives are different, but the communion between that diversity. That's I hadn't thought about that in terms of communication, that at the heart of communication is communing. That's a very interesting notion. Let me broaden the discussion.
Can I just expand a little bit on that same point? And this is in our person-centered world, the direction that Carl Rogers sort of founded. We moved into, I mentioned before, the idea of encounter, and encounter being to stand face to face with difference, to stand face to face with somebody who's holding a different position, not necessarily in conflict, but certainly at least a difference. And for me, that's that whole sense of encountering in our everyday mind, of actually that we are trying to communicate together. And one of the other writers in our realm, Gerald Bozarth, once said something to the effect of, empathy dissolves boundaries. So where there is a difference and a divide between us, that by actually listening to each other, by understanding each other, we can be dissolving that difference.
Yeah. Let me broaden this and just for the sake of getting your insights into it. One is in the realm of statistics.
Mhm.
You know, they many studies. It's now you know, sort of a scientific fact around the statistical realm in which free will exists. That, for example, they can statistically predict how many avalanches will be on a certain mountainside in the Swiss Alps, but they cannot predict the time or the scope of those avalanches.
Mhm.
And in the human realm, you know, they can predict with fair certainty, for example, how many murders are going to happen in New York City in a given year. But they don't know who's going to do it, when it's going to happen, or how it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Similarly with accidents. It's quite extraordinary that at the level of statistics, were pretty predictable in advance, but at the level of how each individual acts within that statistical certainty, it's a complete unknown. So I'd love to hear both of you comment on your sense of how is free will operating in the realm of the absolute of statistical predictability.
You want to go, Steve, or shall I?
Well, I don't mind having a crack in it first. I have a feeling we might come up with something very similar, but who knows? I think you really kind of, if you'd come out with what you've just said at the beginning, there might not have been a need for this conversation in a sense, because I think what you did there, Jim, was sum up really the paradox as exists.
Mm-hmm.
That there's free will because of that uniqueness within us all, but there's also predictability because there's universality within us all. You know, it goes back to perhaps what Aniel was saying about, you know, the autonomy and the homonymy of each person. That these things exist, they coexist, and again, the implicate and the explicate being, you know, part of the same coin, really. So I think it for me, you kind of summed something up very, yeah. These things exist. These things are true. You know, it's. I don't know where you want to go with that, Mark, but.
Would be what I say. So, if I look at the statistics on, say, the number of murders in New York, and I almost wish I could say the number of flowers that bloom in New York or something like that instead. But it's about human action, and a part of that is that we are culturalized, we are socialized, that the statistics are based on our current culture and socialization as a whole, the universality, as you're saying, Steve. And so for me, if you're going to try and reduce those statistics, then it's not about working at a free will level, it's working at the universality, the socialization, the culturalization level that will have its influence on free will. So when I said in my intro, as far as I'm concerned, free will might be, you know, the choice I make, do I or don't I do this, might be a rational, logical, mathematical, scientific definition, or it might be part of my socialization, my indoctrinated values of what is and isn't acceptable and what potentially is possible or not. It might be my genetic makeup. But all that aside, and also supporting all that, is the randomness of the implicate order coming through. So for me to give way from culturalization to the implicate order is like shifting to that more relational being, as you're mentioning, Steve, and also to like the participatory thought, ideas around participatory thought, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it does bring into sharp relief this paradox that's inherent in free will between the one and the many. And it's worth contemplating. And within that spirit, I'd like to broaden it out just a little bit further. Again, just to get your both of your points of view. And that is what is typically called astrology, and the influence of the planets on human behavior. And I'm thinking in this case of the extraordinary research that has been done on the 11-year cycle of sun flares, and the research that shows that as the solar cycle peaks, so does war and human creativity and genius. And then as it ebbs, the aggressive creative impulse also ebbs in the human community. So for example, we were at our solar minimum in 2020. And if you look back over the last 2,000 years, not only in the West, but in the East, there tends to be economic slowdowns, recessions, also pandemics, diseases that happen in the solar minimum. So we have our COVID-19 pandemic, and it seems to come out of the blue. But if you look at the solar flare cycle, it's completely where it would naturally be. And if you've read Rick Tarnas's masterwork, Cosmos and Psyche, he goes back 2,500 years and shows that when there's an alignment of Pluto and Uranus, for example, there's a revolutionary fervor that is spontaneously, like in the 60s, etc. That was a period, and you can replicate it back to the French Revolution, etc., all the way back through time, where revolutions just tend to break out when Pluto and Uranus are in some kind of a conjunction or opposition. And so how did the two of you understand the notion, again, of free will and statistical predictability within the context of the movement of our solar system, the rise and fall of the flares of the sun, which seem to have such a powerful impact, as Rick Tarnas says, through the complexities of the archetype. He takes the position that you can't be predictive with astrology, but you can certainly lay out the archetypal forces that inform human attitudes and behavior in a way that, when understood over time, again, have a statistical reliability, shall we say, about how individuals are going to express their free will in a way consistent with the larger order of things.
Okay, I'll make a start on this one. I think for me, this goes back to David Bohm and the idea of reversing the idea that there are particles, planets out there that influence the processes, and turning it round more into the idea of the flow between implicate and explicate, that there's simply a huge bed of randomness, and there's like clouds of formation and deformation. And therefore, we're interpreting these moves as moves of the planets. And yet it's simply a cloud of random happenings, as we're all subclouds to that implicate order. It's just particularly clouds of random happening that are changing in their density of the happenings. And we're seeing patterns within patterns. So the cyclical nature of the planets and their alignment coming together every 11 years in one particular instance, I think you said. and that sort of idea. So for me, it's more a case of we're at a creative rise or a creative fall, and that shows up as the planets becoming into alignment or not. I think for me, it works that way around, that the random cloud is tending towards greater creativity, or it's tending towards decreation or deconstruction or destructiveness. And it's not just, we're seeing it as the planets, but we're also experiencing it as, statistically, the free will of individuals is taking us one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for me, it's again, it comes to, it's inconceivable to me that the environment doesn't affect who and what we are at any given time, or at least it creates something that we have to operate with. Whether we're creative in a destructive way or creative in a good way is, I think, that's where the free will really kind of starts to kind of come into its own, I think, on an individual basis, so that, you know, it wasn't shortly after the COVID pandemic that people really kind of buckled down and actually got to producing a vaccine in the shortest period of time kind of known, I think, within science. So whether something's creative or destructive or creatively destructive, that our individual free will creates the opportunity to then go forth and do something creatively rather special and good. But energetically, it makes absolute sense to me that you know, the wider universe, the cosmos, kind of creates circumstances, and that has some kind of order that exists within it. I mean, it's what, you know, it happens with all things. So on an energetic level, I understand that.
Yeah, well, good. Well, as we bring our session to a close, I want to ask each of you, starting with you, Steve and Mark, just to summarize in a minute or two, you know, the essence of what you're seeking to communicate today about this very complex challenge of understanding free will within the context of a cosmic order. So, Steve, how would you summarize your position? I know that's always a challenge to a philosopher, but it's a good one, actually. As Einstein said, it takes a genius to see simplicity.
Well, I guess for me, the relational endeavor is so important that, you know, through my fixity, my rigidity, because of all the conditioning that I've, you know, inherited over the many years, there's still an opportunity for me to somehow see something different, to connect with somebody, to bring about through my own sense of will, and that word freedom is important here. That to add to slightly distort the word into freedom, or change the word into freedom, because the freedom happens, I think, when interaction, when I can actually bring the other person, as Levinas might say, into service, seeing the other person as an aspect of me. That's where I think is the essence of this kind of moving towards something bigger and freer.
Beautifully put. that whatever it is, it's relational.
Yes. Yeah. Whether that's internally or externally, yeah. Goes
Very
inwards
good
and
point.
outwards at the same
Very
time.
good point. Yeah, no man is an island.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or island is an island. Yeah.
Mark, what would be your summarizing statement?
I think there's two things for me. I've just noticed Cuff Ferguson's name go by in the chat, and it was Cuff that brought me into Humanity Rising round about day 450, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And within the sets of discussions he offered, one was on the spiritual and talking about soul contracts, an idea from some of the African religions that I think a new idea for me, but it fitted really well. And it's a sense that I do believe I have an eternal life. I do believe that the cloud of me, the randomness that is a cloud, a bird murmuring of me, sits there within the implicate order and unfolds into this free will that I now offer. It shapes, that bit of randomness shapes exactly where I go. And so the bottom line for me, the notes on the board behind are a book writing project. I think that's where you first asked about it, where I said about free will. And one of the lines that I've used from there, so this maybe sounds a bit rehearsed, but I believe basically that there is a wholeness, a oneness to everything. And I believe that we're at our best when we're most attuned and most aligned to that flow and that oneness. So I'd leave it at that for me.
Not my will, but thine be done.
Almost. Although thine being a big cloud of random.
Yeah. Thine being reinterpreted under modern physics. Well, thank you both so much. I think the notion of free will is relational. I think the notion of free will as a submission to a higher wholeness are both profound notions that we can all contemplate very deeply to our edification. So I want to thank you both. I also want to note what Shannon brought in about wondering what this discussion would have been like had several women been presenting their notion. And that raises a whole issue too of whether there's a masculine notion of free will and as opposed to a feminine notion of free will, and what a group of women would have said about these matters. And that's worth thinking about. So Shannon, if you have any ideas, let us know, because that's what makes Humanity Rising so, I think, rich and textured, is that we seek with each session to find what forward motion we can contemplate. And that's what keeps everything moving forward in a deeper and more expanded way. But I think what we've heard today has been very profound, everyone, and very deeply edifying around an issue that all of us, one way or another, consciously or unconsciously, grapple with. Because to the degree to which we answer the question of free will, we shape our destiny. And we also shape our self-esteem. And we shape our authenticity and capacity to be actors in the world. So this is not an idle intellectual pursuit. This has to do with the essence of who we are as human beings, and ultimately whether we're accountable. Without free will, there's no accountability. And accountability is at the essence of human dignity. So this is a very profound issue. So Mark, Steve, I thank you very much. Let's keep this conversation going, and maybe we can reconnect down the trail, maybe with a group of women and maybe people from other cultures. It'd be interesting to see what an indigenous Aboriginal from Australia would say about free will from the point of view of his dreamlines or her dreamlines. And so we'll continue this discussion as the Humanity Rising unfolds. So that does it for us for today, everyone. Thank you very much. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. Stan has put the link in the chat box, and we'll see you tomorrow for a dive into another domain, and that is human peak performance. What does it take for human beings to engage in peak performance? That'll be our subject for tomorrow with Kurt Kruger and friends. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow, same time, same station. Bye for now. Have a wonderful day.